topic that I want to talk about today, guys, the first time that I can really remember experiencing this in my life, and I can remember it vividly, was several years ago. A lot of you know my story. I was married when I was really young. I was probably about 21, something like that. After about a year of marriage, my wife left me. I was heartbroken, depressed. I did not want to get a divorce, but she was done and she left. And so about a month later, just happened that was when school registration for chiropractic school fell into place. And if I was going to do it that year, I had to act quickly. So I went home, lived with my parents, and a month later, I found myself in Kansas City. Now, I'm a West Virginia boy. And even though I live in Virginia, I'm still a West Virginia boy. That's something that never goes away. Just ask HB or Dave Coons. But I'm a West Virginia boy. And I always remember this because it made such a profound impression on me. And that is, my family took me out to Kansas City. They got me unpacked. They got me in a place. They got me registered for school. They loved me, cared for me, took me out there. It was a month after my divorce. I was depressed. I was lonely. And then they went back to West Virginia. And I remember that first day in Kansas City. And I woke up and I remember thinking to myself, everything that I've ever known, everyone that I've ever known is 1,000 miles away from me. And I did what we all do when we feel alone, and that is I looked for something to distract myself. So I decided to go to a movie. And I couldn't tell you what the movie was, but I can tell you what I felt when I went in, because for the first time in my life, at about the age of 22, I walked into a movie theater and sat down by myself. No one was with me. I went to see a movie by myself. And for the first time in my life, and I can remember it coming over me like a wave. I mean, it was just almost overwhelming. But for the first time in my life, really, I felt loneliness, right? For the first time in my life, I really felt loneliness. So what I want you guys to do right now is just take a few minutes at the tables. I want you to talk about a time in your life when you can really remember, it's an instance or a period of time in your life when you really felt loneliness. All right? 1, 2, 3, go. All right, guys, I know I'm cutting you off, but we got limited time here this morning. The point that I wanted to make there is this is something that we can all relate to. This is something that we can all relate to in our past, but when we actually stop and we look at what the definition of loneliness is, and that is a feeling of being unloved, a feeling of not belonging, a feeling of separation. Specifically, a definition that I think really applies is a feeling of isolation. When we start to look at loneliness through that lens, through those perspectives, loneliness is something we all deal with. Loneliness is something that doesn't just happen in the past. Loneliness is something that we deal with frequently. It's something that happens in our lives. Another interesting thing about loneliness is we really fear it. I was thinking back about when April and I first got together, and that was after I came back from Kansas City, and I moved here to Lynchburg, and I bought a house. And this is before we were Christ followers, and this is now my wife. But I bought a house. She moved in with me. You guys can see where this is going. Not a chance at all that, apart from Jesus, that this was going to work out. But we would have these just epic battles. I mean, epic fights, right? And I would flip out and I would say, "That's it, you're out of here." Kick her out of the house. And she would go home and live with her parents for a couple days. And then I would call her and I would say, "Please, please come back." And then she would come back. And this cycle repeated. And why do you think we did that? Why do you think we repeated that cycle? Because you see, the politically correct thing for me to say to you would be because we really loved each other and it was fate that we were going to be together. But the reality is, not living as Christ followers, the reality is that when it came to a choice between living in a dysfunctional relationship or being alone, we'd rather live in a dysfunctional relationship because there's a fear of being alone. And not only is there fear of being alone, but statistically speaking, if you go on and look online, loneliness is on the rise. Now this is interesting because we are socially the most connected culture in the history of the world, right? We are connected in ways that in history no other culture has ever had. However, loneliness is still on the rise. Just to give you guys a few statistics that I looked up this week, 25% of people in America right now, that is 1 in 4 people, feel that they have no one to confide in. No one that they can really tell what's going on in their lives. 40% of Americans polled said that they would describe themselves as suffering from chronic loneliness. So much so that a lot of scientists are now referring to this as an epidemic, and they've given it a name, which is what they do. They name epidemics, and they've called it chronic loneliness syndrome. Yeah, I mean, we could pretty much guess what that was going to be, but 40% of Americans. Stop and think about that, guys. That's almost half. That's almost half of all Americans would describe themselves as chronically lonely. So the question becomes, where did this all start? Where did this cycle of loneliness that's still increasing, where did it start? Well, depends on who you talk to. If you read those same studies, they've all got their opinion at the bottom of it. And you'll hear things such as, well, as soon as we started having mother and father both working, right, that started the cycle of loneliness. Or kids got really involved in school and now we don't have dinner time together. Or TVs, now there's TVs in each individual room in the house, so people aren't spending time together. Or social media, right? We've got these little snippets where we meet with people, but we're not actually face-to-face communicating with them. All of these sociologists, all these people, they have a reason that they can describe to you, the world can describe to you as why loneliness is prevalent and where it comes from. And basically it boils down to two things: proximity and affinity. This is the world's answer to loneliness. Proximity and affinity. Proximity, get as many people around you as you can. Get as many distractions around you as you can. And affinity, which means if you're really lucky, you can get as many people who like the same distractions that you do and place them in your life. That's the world's cause and solution to loneliness. So what does God say about loneliness? Well, first of all, where does God say loneliness came from? Well, to go to that, I would say in the beginning. In the beginning. Right? We go back to the beginning, the first chapter of the Bible, Genesis. And what do we see? We see the Creator doing what creators do. He's creating. And at the end of each day, what does he say? He looks at it and he sees that it is good. What is the first day that he says it's not good? Man was alone. Now this is interesting, guys. I'd never thought about this before, but, Adam had a personal relationship with God. Adam was righteous with God. Adam had a relationship with God that was on God's terms. So Adam was right with God. But even with that, God still looked at Adam and said, this isn't good. Why is this significant? Because we as men sometimes get this stupid idea that we can do it on our own. Why is this significant? How many times have you met somebody out there that said, I don't need to be in community. I don't need to be a part of a church. It's just me and God. How many times have you heard that? A lot, right? How many times have you believed that? Well, what God says is, it's not good. It's not good. Even if you're right with God, even if you're meeting God on God's terms, it's not good for you to be alone. God said so, not me. God said so. So what did God do? He created a companion. Why did God create a companion? So that Adam would have somebody to walk out this relationship with God and to experience this relationship with God with. Things are going good. God looks at that. He says it's good. One chapter later, things go bad. Right? And we all know the story. Eve ate the apple from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God told her specifically not to do that. Sin entered the world. All of a sudden now, we see Adam hiding from God. What do we see? Isolation, separation, loneliness for the first time between man and God. The next thing that we see is Adam pointing over at his companion that God gave him and saying, she did it. And so what do we see there? Separation and isolation between relationships with human beings. Human beings that God created for relationship because it was good. And for the first time we see loneliness. And what God says is, loneliness is not the result of proximity and affinity like the world says. What God says is, loneliness is the result of sin that first of all has derailed our relationship with God, and secondarily to that has derailed our relationships with other people. So the question becomes, what do we do about that? The first decision that we have to make is, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the world? Are you going to believe what comes naturally to you? If you are, what I would say to you is to go out, try to be the most popular guy in town, surround yourself with as many people as possible, and fill your schedule up as busy as possible. If you believe what the world says on how to deal with loneliness, that'll be your response. And I would also say that's what comes naturally to you. If you believe what God says, then we have to address two things. First, we have to address the relationship with God, and after that, now we can start to address relationships with other people. How do we address the relationship with God? I'm looking around the room. Most of the guys in this room know the answer to this question. John chapter 16, verse 4, Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Let me ask you a question. How many people take care of the problem of sin, and come to the Father without Jesus Christ? Somebody said.
None.
Exactly. Jesus said, no one comes to the Father except through me. Okay? So the only way that we address the problem between us and God is through a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. He invites us. We make a decision as to whether or not to respond to that. After that, once we've been made right with God, the sin between us and God has been taken care of. And as we remain in Him, now we're able to start to look at the relationships on a horizontal level. And what I want to read to you guys today, and this is a verse that we've read before, and I've read over and over for different things, but I saw it differently this time around. I'm going to start out in Hebrews 10, verse 22. And the author of Hebrews says, "Let us draw near to God with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for He who promised is faithful." What is he talking about there? He's talking about that first thing I was talking about, getting right with God through a relationship with Jesus Christ. Who's he talking about when he said, "For He who is promised is faithful"? He's talking about Jesus, right? But now let's look at the second part, when he talks about relationships with other people. "And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." I want to introduce a new term, guys, right now. GCR. Let me hear you guys say that. GCR. Gospel-centered relationships. Gospel-centered relationships. Let me hear you say that. Gospel-centered relationships. What is a gospel-centered relationship? A gospel-centered relationship is a relationship between one or two people, or if you're really lucky, one and a few people, where at the center of that relationship is the gospel. At the center of that relationship is a relationship with Jesus Christ being shared by a group of people. So what's it look like? Paul just spelled it out for us. Let us not give up meeting together, the habit of meeting together. That means the people that you're in a gospel-centered relationship with, you're meeting with them habitually. That is, not once a year, not once every couple years, but you're meeting with them regularly. The second thing that he says is, let us encourage one another. These guys that you're meeting with, are they encouraging you? And secondly, spurring one another on towards love and good deeds. What does that mean? He's talking about obedience. Obedience to God. See, one of the ways that I think that you can tell that if you have a gospel-centered relationship with someone is, how do you handle the problem, ultimately, the problem that is between you and that person, which is sin. You want to know if you have a gospel-centered relationship with someone, how do you handle sin in that relationship? Because you're going to screw up against them and they're going to screw up against you. Do you do what the world typically does, which is you stuff it, you ignore it, you write them off, and you just stop hanging out with them altogether? Or do you go to them? Is there confession? Is there repentance? And most of all, is there grace and forgiveness? One of the primary ways you can tell if you have a gospel-centered relationship is how you handle sin in that relationship. And then finally, as we look forward to the coming day, the day. What's he talking about? The day. The day, the day that Jesus comes back, right? So what I'm saying here, guys, is it's not that you can't get together with your buds and sit down and talk about, this is the crap that's going on in my life. This is the things that I'm struggling with right now. That's not what I'm saying, that you can't talk about those things. But what I'm saying is you look at them together through the filter of the future of what's coming. You look at them together through the filter of Jesus Christ. You look at them through the filter of eternal ramifications, not just what's going on with that day. Do these guys point you back towards Jesus Christ? Do they pray with you? These are gospel-centered relationships. You see, guys, what the world wants you to believe is this: proximity and affinity. What the world tells you is the cure for loneliness is surround yourself with as many friends as possible and get really busy. Fill your schedule up as much as possible, and this is where you put your focus. This is how you deal with loneliness. And down at the bottom, you might have a little bit of Jesus. Maybe you said a prayer when you were 12. Maybe you show up to church on Sunday. What do your gospel-centered relationships look like? Well, a lot of times it looks like showing up on church on Sunday and putting on the happy face, but really nobody knows where you're at. You're not really being transparent with anyone. This is the world's answer, and for a large part, a lot of Christianity's answer for how we deal with loneliness. And what I want to tell you guys is, from personal experience, you can have literally hundreds of people around you during the week and be completely alone. I know from personal experience. The other thing I know from personal experience is, this is a recipe for loneliness. This is a recipe for not remaining in Jesus Christ. Haven't been engaged for the last 5, probably 6 years, whatever it's been now. I have seen countless men make a profession of faith and then turn around and walk away because they were following this formula, because they believed this, because they were looking for the answer here and not here. If you're new, if you just got baptized, if you're a new believer here, listen closely to this. This is a recipe for disaster. But this is what the world tells you. This is what comes naturally. What does God say? God says the first thing we need to do is address the first problem, which is our relationship with God, the dysfunction between us and God. And as we talked about, the only way to do that is through a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. How will you know if someone believes in Jesus Christ? Because they'll obey His commands. They'll follow Him, and you'll see fruit in their lives. That's how you'll know. Once you have that, once you're connected with Jesus, now you have an option. You can stay there, or you can listen to what God said to Adam, which is, it's not good for man to be alone. But be careful about who you choose. Be careful about where you go from here. This is the point that I really want you guys to get. Because right now you have an opportunity. If you remain connected with Jesus, and you find other people that are connected with Jesus, you have a huge opportunity here, guys. You have an opportunity to experience relationship the way God intended them to be experienced. You have an opportunity to enter into relationships the way God intended. And then after that, others. And these others is not a bad thing. This is where, for example, evangelism occurs. Which, as you know, I'm big on that. This is where evangelism occurs. But when it comes to our loneliness bucket, guys, right here, this is where our loneliness bucket gets filled. Our personal relationship with Jesus Christ and our gospel-centered relationships with our brothers or our wives. This is where our loneliness bucket gets filled, it gets turned into love, and this is where we pour it out into others. Not the reverse. Okay? And so once you have this, guys, once you have the gospel-centered relationships, once you've been made right, first of all, with Jesus Christ, and you experience the peace, the joy, and the love that only He can bring into your life, that only He can bring into your hearts, now you're free to move into these gospel-centered relationships where you remain connected with Jesus and someone else remains connected with Jesus, and you start to walk this out. And if you can do this, when you do this, you will know and be known. You will love and be loved. And you will experience the peace that comes from receiving that from another human being. And you will experience the joy that comes from giving that to others. Okay? Questions for today? Do you have any gospel-centered relationships, GCR, in your life? If so, tell us what they look like. If not, what's the holdup? Where in your life do you experience loneliness or isolation? And then the third question is, where do you turn to deal with it? First example would be distraction. TV, work, superficial relationships. The next one would be quick fixes, food, porn, alcohol, etc. Or maybe you're handling it correctly. Scripture, prayer, or reaching out to community. And then finally, pray for one another. But I wanted to read something to you. This is from Philippians, and this is Paul. And Philippians, I didn't really know this, but Philippians is oftentimes referred to as the joy letter because Paul refers to joy in this over 16 times, specifically talking about joy and how we get it. Talks about joy in suffering, joy in serving, joy in believing, joy in giving. It's like I said, this is known as the joy letter because Paul is just filled with such joy. Let me read this to you, just the first paragraph. He says, I thank my God every time I remember you. He's writing to the church of Philippi. In all of my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership, gospel-centered relationships, guys, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to the completion until the day of Jesus Christ. You know what's amazing about this? This gospel, the joy gospel, this joy letter that Paul wrote he wrote it from prison. He was in prison at the time. And the people that he's writing to were nowhere around him. He was alone. In all likelihood, he was sick. He was malnourished. He was cold. He was beaten. And he was waiting to die. Right? You put me in those circumstances, I'm probably going to write a letter and say, please get me out of here. Help me, help me. How was Paul able to do that? How was Paul not writing about how lonely he was in prison? Because of his circumstances. That so naturally many of us would just intuitively go there. How was he able to do that? He addressed it. First of all, he filled his loneliness bucket with, first of all, his relationship with Jesus, and then the people that he was writing to, which was his gospel-centered relationships. And wrote from prison, all alone, sick, beaten, and bruised, what is now known as the joy letter. So guys, don't believe the lie. Don't buy into the lie. Write your own joy letter. Make it your life. But this is it.